I am Emma Carter, a female park ranger working in Montana. My job is to patrol and protect the wilderness, a mission I have been dedicated to for over 10 years. I always thought I was prepared for anything, from facing wild animals to enduring bone-chilling winter days. But that morning changed everything. That day was one of the harshest winters I had ever experienced. The temperature had plummeted to a record 40 degrees Celsius, and piercing winds blew through the canyons as if trying to tear everything apart. I was standing in my small wooden cabin, savoring a hot cup of coffee by the cozy fireplace. Outside, everything was blanketed in snow, and the gray sky offered no hint of sunlight. It was the kind of day when you'd rather stay indoors and not even think about stepping outside. But then, the silence was abruptly broken. I was gazing out of the living room window, watching the snowflakes fall when a large figure appeared in the distance. At first, I thought it was just an illusion caused by light reflecting on the icy surface. But as the dark shape moved closer, I realized it was a bear, a mother bear. Its fur was matted with ice and snow, and each of its heavy steps seemed like a struggle against the relentless cold. What startled me even more was that it was heading straight toward my cabin window. Through the frost-covered glass, I could see its face clearly. Its eyes held a pleading expression, almost as if it were begging for help. Before I could process what I was seeing, the bear raised a paw and tapped lightly on the window pane, creating a sound like a knock, a steady rhythm, as if it were trying to communicate something. My heart raced. As a ranger, I knew bears almost never approach humans, especially in winter when they are supposed to be hibernating. I wondered, what has happened? Why is it here? Pressing my face closer to the window, I saw them, 3 small bear cubs shivering in the snow, huddled close to their mother's legs. The cubs looked so fragile. They trembled incessantly, their breaths barely visible in the frigid air. The smallest one, its fur encrusted with ice, lay motionless in the snow. From this distance, I couldn't even be sure if it was still alive. The mother bear turned to look at her weakest cub, then gently picked it up with her mouth. She stepped closer, her gaze fixed on me, her eyes almost saying, "Please help us." I took a step back, gripping my coffee cup so tightly I thought it might shatter. I couldn't take my eyes off the scene. The mother bear set her cub down in front of the window, then sat in a peculiar posture, her hind legs tucked beneath her, her front paws clasped together as if in prayer. I took a deep breath, trying to make sense of what I was witnessing, but every theory I'd learned failed to explain this. Outside, the wind howled even louder, swirling snow into small, chaotic eddies. The mother bear kept knocking on the window, her rhythm growing more urgent. Meanwhile, the 2 remaining cubs clung to each other, desperately seeking warmth from their mother. I could see their faint breaths rising into the freezing air, quickly dissipating. One of the cubs began to wobble, almost collapsing. I felt every beat of my heart pounding in my chest. As a ranger, I had always been taught to keep my distance from wildlife and let them fend for themselves, but this wasn't a normal situation. The mother bear's eyes were filled with such anguish and desperation that ignoring it felt impossible. I stood frozen, torn, wondering, what should I do? Should I intervene? If I open the door, what will happen? Outside, the cold seemed even more merciless. A thin layer of frost had started forming on the inside of the window, coating the glass like a translucent veil. The mother bear knocked again, harder this time, and the sound felt like it pierced straight into my heart. She looked at me, her eyes seeming to plead. I don't have much time left. I knew that morning would not be as peaceful as the others, and my decision could change everything. The cold wind kept howling outside, as if trying to engulf everything in an endless chill. The mother bear remained patiently standing there, but her eyes grew increasingly desperate. I realized that if nothing was done, those bear cubs wouldn't make it. I pressed my hand against my chest, feeling my heart pounding heavily. There was something deep in the mother bear's gaze, not wild instinct, but a heartfelt plea, like a mother begging for her children. Through the frosted glass, I observed her actions more closely. The mother bear bent down, checking on each cub. She repeatedly lifted her head to look at me, then bent down again to tend to the smallest cub. With her massive yet careful paws, she brushed snow off the cub's body, as if trying to retain the last remnants of warmth. The other two cubs huddled close together, trembling, their tiny bodies nearly swallowed by the thick snow. Moments later, the mother bear suddenly sat down. She raised her front paws and clasped them together in front of her chest as if in prayer. I froze. The scene was surreal, so unlike anything I had ever been taught. As a ranger, I understood that wild animals acted on instinct, but this behavior carried a different meaning. It wasn't just desperation, it was an attempt to communicate. The urgency in her movements grew as she repeated the gestures. She scraped her paw across the snow outside the door, creating simple markings like symbols. She knocked on the glass again, her rhythm more forceful and deliberate. The mother bear looked at me, her eyes screaming, "Please, help me." I didn't know what had driven this bear family out of their den in the middle of winter, perhaps an avalanche or some other threat. But it was clear they couldn't handle this situation on their own. The smallest cub, lying on the snow, was barely moving. I could see frost forming on its fragile fur. The mother bear bent down again, nudging the weak body gently with her nose as if trying to transfer her warmth. When she lifted her head, I noticed frozen tears on her face. Yes, tears. The sight sent chills through me. The mother bear didn't growl or make any threatening sounds. Instead, she let out small, faint cries like a plea. The other two cubs weren't much better off. One of them wobbled unsteadily before collapsing next to its mother. The mother bear immediately turned to steady it, using her large paw to pull it closer, keeping it from falling further away. The remaining cub clung tightly to its mother's leg, its frightened eyes dim and unfocused. I stood there, watching this unfold in helplessness. Their pain wasn't just from the brutal cold, but also from the despair of a family on the brink of death. I suddenly recalled the lessons from my early days as a ranger. My instructor had once said, "Wild animals don't need human help. They've survived on their own for thousands of years." But now, faced with this scene, I realized there were exceptions. The mother bear's gaze wasn't just a plea for her cubs. It was a reminder that sometimes nature itself needs the kindness of humans. The mother bear didn't give up. She picked up the smallest cub again and moved closer to the glass door. Gently, she pressed the cub against the freezing glass, as if to show me how dire its condition was. Through the glass, I could see the cub's faint breaths forming weak, fleeting puffs of air. Its tiny chest rose and fell with great difficulty. I bit my lip hard. If I didn't act now, the cub wouldn't survive. The mother bear kept her eyes on me, their depth filled with what felt like a final plea for help. She placed the cub down on the ground and made another extraordinary gesture. Using her paw, she drew a circle around the weakest cub, as if emphasizing its fragile life. Then she looked at me again. I felt as though her gaze pierced my very soul, compelling me to act. The other two cubs trembled, trying to stay close to their mother for comfort. Yet the mother bear didn't relent. She turned back to the window, placing both front paws against the glass, her eyes now carrying a commanding urgency. "You are our last hope." I stood there, my heart constricted by the overwhelming emotion of the scene. Outside, the wind kept howling and the snow continued to fall relentlessly, but all I could hear was the unspoken plea in the mother bear's eyes. I knew I couldn't stand idly by any longer. That morning, I had to make a decision. My hand rested on the doorknob, my palm drenched in sweat despite the warmth inside the house. The cold from outside seemed to seep through the thick wooden door, threatening to cloud my thoughts. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but my heart pounded relentlessly, as if protesting the decision my rational mind had dismissed minutes ago. As a forest ranger, I understood the danger of letting a wild bear near humans. But that morning, I had no other choice. I turned the doorknob slowly, afraid that even the slightest sound might startle the mother bear. When the door creaked open, a blast of icy wind swept in, carrying the smell of snow and a deafening stillness. Holding my breath, I looked at the mother bear standing just a few steps from the door. She didn't appear aggressive or out of control. On the contrary, her eyes held an urgency and an unbelievable patience. It felt as if she understood that my decision was for her family's sake. The mother bear stared at me for a long moment, seemingly waiting for a clear signal. I nodded slightly, shifting my body to create just enough space. She immediately turned around and gently picked up her weakest cub with her mouth. I stepped back, giving her room to approach. What happened next left me stunned. The mother bear approached the threshold, bent down, and placed the smallest cub onto the wooden floor with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a wild animal. She didn't rush inside, but backed away a few steps, bowing her head as if to express gratitude. I stood there, speechless, watching the motionless cub lying on the wooden floor. Its breathing was so faint it was barely perceptible, but I knew that inside the warmth of the house, its chances of survival would be much higher. The mother bear waited for a moment, then returned to the other two cubs. One by one, she carried them inside. Each time she repeated the act of backing away and bowing her head, as if asking for permission before taking another step. I had never witnessed such incredible restraint in a wild animal. When all three cubs were safely inside, I looked at the mother bear, wondering if she planned to come in herself. She didn't rush. Instead, the mother bear did something I would never forget. She bent down into the snow and used her massive paw to brush off the icy frost clinging to her thick fur, as though cleaning herself before entering the house. After tidying up, she paused and looked at me again, as if seeking approval. I couldn't do anything but nod and open the door wider. Only then did she step inside, one careful step at a time. Inside the house, the mother bear headed straight for the corner of the room where her cubs were lying. She didn't rush to embrace them as I expected, but instead bent down to inspect each one. One of the healthier cubs had already started moving, seeking warmth from its mother. The mother bear gently nudged it closer to her, then turned her attention to the weakest cub. She repeatedly nuzzled its tiny body with her nose, as if trying to transfer her warmth through her thick fur. I stood there, not daring to make any sudden movements, my eyes glued to the scene. My instincts told me to keep my distance, but my heart urged me to step closer. However, I knew this was a moment for the mother bear to do what she needed for her cubs. Even so, what amazed me most was how she behaved in a human space, completely unlike anything I had been taught about wild animals. She stayed in the corner of the room, never stepping further into the house. She didn't rummage through the space or search for food. Even when one of the cubs accidentally rolled toward the bookshelf, the mother bear used her massive paw to pull it back, avoiding any contact with the furniture. Every movement was remarkably careful, as if she understood this was a human space and she didn't want to intrude. After a while, when the three cubs began to recover, they started to move more freely. I saw them stir, their eyes slowly opening. The mother bear remained in her corner, her gaze alert but composed. Occasionally, she glanced at me, her eyes seeming to check if I was bothered. I said nothing, only nodding slightly, as if to say everything was fine. I couldn't take my eyes off the scene. A family of wild bears, fighting to survive together, right inside my house. The mother bear not only displayed maternal instincts, but also an intelligence far beyond what I had ever imagined. She didn't just know how to seek help, she knew how to respect human space. It made me wonder, do they understand more than we think? The wind howled outside, but inside the small house, I felt a different kind of warmth. Not just from the fireplace, but from the presence of these extraordinary creatures. Mother Bear sat quietly in the corner of the room, her eyes never leaving her cubs. The three bear cubs were beginning to recover, but they were still weak. I noticed the mother bear constantly checking on them, gently nudging each one with her nose, as if to ensure they were all right. Without making a sound, her movements and the way she cared for them exuded a maternal love so strong that I had never witnessed anything like it before. I stood at a distance, keeping a safe space, observing her every move. As a ranger, I had been trained to interpret the behavior of wild animals. But the actions of this mother bear went far beyond what I had ever learned. She wasn't simply operating on survival instincts. There was something in the way she looked at me and how she kept her cubs quiet that made me feel she was communicating with me, not through sounds, but through her eyes and gestures. After a while, the mother bear turned to look at me, her eyes seeming to ask a question. I felt a strange pressure, as if the air in the small room had grown heavier. I couldn't explain the sensation, but I understood that she was relying on me. Suddenly, I remembered the bowl of water I had left near the fireplace. With some hesitation, I stepped forward, picked up the bowl, and placed it on the floor near the mother bear. She didn't rush to it immediately, but kept her cautious gaze on me. It took a long moment before she moved. The mother bear leaned down, sniffed the bowl, and then gently lapped at the water with her tongue. Afterward, she turned to her cubs, nudging them toward the bowl with her nose. The two stronger cubs began to drink, while the weakest one remained motionless. The mother bear didn't overlook it. She lifted the smallest cub, cradling it with her front legs, and helped it reach the bowl. Watching this scene, I couldn't hold back my emotions. Her actions were so tender, so different from the image of a wild, powerful, and ferocious bear I had known. When the cubs finished drinking, the mother bear guided them back to the corner of the room, as if trying to keep them from disturbing my space. Her behavior was astounding. One curious cub tried to venture into the middle of the room, but the mother bear immediately pulled it back with her paw, letting out a soft sound that seemed like a warning. I stood there, amazed. She not only had remarkable self-control, but also knew how to manage her cubs, ensuring they didn't disrupt anything. A while later, I heard a noise from under the table. It was Whiskers, my cat, peeking out. I froze. As a ranger, I knew that cats and bears were not a safe combination. I feared that Whiskers' presence might provoke the mother bear, but what happened next astonished me. The mother bear didn't growl or show any signs of aggression. Instead, she pulled her cubs closer and let out a low, calming sound I had never heard from a bear before. It felt like reassurance. Whiskers slowly approached the mother bear, his eyes wary but not fearful. I held my breath as the mother bear lowered her head to almost the same level as my cat. For a few seconds, the two creatures, so completely different, gazed at each other as if exchanging a silent message. Whiskers didn't run away. He simply stood there, quietly observing. The mother bear remained still, not making any threatening moves. Even when one of her cubs curiously reached out toward Whiskers, she pulled it back gently, as if protecting both of them. The sight left me wondering, how could a wild bear act with such awareness? I continued to watch, realizing that the mother bear wasn't just controlling her cubs, she was also carefully managing her presence in my space. She didn't wander into the center of the room or attempt to explore or damage any furniture. I saw her pull a fallen blanket from the floor and wrap it around her cubs to keep them warmer. This act, along with her patience and care in everything she did, made me feel like I was witnessing something that transcended ordinary animal behavior. As time passed, I felt a strange shift in the atmosphere. The mother bear was no longer just an uninvited guest in my home. She had become a part of this space, bringing with her a sense of peace and a profound lesson about understanding between humans and nature. I stood there in silence, watching the bear family, wondering how this extraordinary morning would shape the rest of my life. The warmth in the house gradually made the atmosphere more peaceful. The bear cubs began to recover noticeably. The weakest one, which had previously lain motionless, now managed to lift its head, its breathing more steady. I watched the mother bear tending to them, her every action imbued with an almost unbelievable gentleness. Though I kept my distance, I couldn't stop myself from feeling a strange connection to this wild creature. A while later, the mother bear raised her head and looked at me. Her gaze seemed different from before. It no longer carried desperate anxiety, but rather a calmness, as if she knew everything was going to be all right. I stood still, saying nothing, waiting to see what would happen next. The mother bear bent down, gently licking each of her cubs' heads, then stood up and turned toward the door. I knew it was time for her to leave. But what surprised me was the way she acted. The mother bear wasn't hurried or rushed. Instead, she looked around the house, as if making sure she wasn't leaving behind anything troublesome. She gently used her paw to gather some snow that had fallen from her fur into a small pile near the door, as though she wanted to clean up after herself. Then she turned to her three cubs and let out a soft call, just enough for them to understand her intention. I stood silently, observing as the mother bear guided her cubs toward the door. She didn't let them wander freely, but kept them in line, each step cautious as though she were leading a group of students. When each cub reached the threshold, it stopped, lifted a paw, and looked back at its mother as if awaiting a signal. The mother bear simply nodded slightly, and they continued forward. I couldn't believe my eyes. Their actions resembled a ritual, full of awareness and discipline. Once all three cubs had stepped outside, the mother bear turned back to look at me again. This time, she took a few steps toward me. My heart pounded, unsure of her intentions. But instead of showing any signs of aggression, she gently lifted a paw and placed it on my hand for a brief moment. Her eyes were deep and expressive, as if she wanted to say thank you. I could feel the weight, yet also the warmth of that massive paw. Then she stepped back, bowed her head deeply. An act of respect I never thought possible from a wild bear. As I opened the door wider to let them out, the mother bear did something that completely took me by surprise. She paused at the door and used her paw to mimic a wave goodbye. Then, one by one, each cub followed her lead, raising their tiny paws toward me. A chill ran down my spine, not from the cold outside, but from the overwhelming emotion of the moment. When the bear family had reached the porch, the mother bear turned back once more, checking on her cubs before leading them into the forest. Even as they disappeared into the distance, they didn't scatter, but maintained their orderly formation, like a quiet procession. I stood at the door, watching their silhouettes fade into the white snow. My heart was overwhelmed with a mix of emotions: amazement, admiration, and deep sentiment. At that moment, I turned back to look at my room. Everything was intact, with no signs of disturbance. The corner where the bear family had rested now held only a slightly wrinkled blanket, and near the door, on the thin layer of snow, I saw a deep paw print, the mother bear's, like a reminder that everything that had just happened wasn't a dream. I stood there silently, my hand touching the spot where her paw had rested. Part of me wanted to follow them, but another part understood that this moment was meant to remain as it was, a beautiful, magical memory, never to be repeated. I stood silently on the porch, my eyes still following the silhouette of the bear family disappearing into the snowy forest. The biting cold of the winter wind no longer seemed to matter. In that moment, I couldn't think of anything but the miracle I had just witnessed. A morning that seemed so ordinary had completely changed the way I viewed the world. As a ranger, I had spent years living close to nature, understanding its harsh laws. I always believed that wildlife survived on instinct alone, without needing human intervention. But today, all of those beliefs were challenged. The mother bear and her cubs had shown me another side, a glimpse of intelligence, emotion, and communication I had never imagined. I looked down at the mother bear's footprints in the snow near the door, my heart brimming with emotion. They weren't just the tracks of a wild animal that had been here. They felt like a message, a reminder that there's an invisible connection between humans and nature that we often forget. The mother bear hadn't come here just to seek help. She had taught me a profound lesson about trust and understanding. I turned back into the house, sitting down in a chair near the fireplace, my eyes unable to let go of the images I had just experienced. The room was quiet now, with only the crackling sound of firewood. But I felt an undeniable shift. My perspective on my work, on life, and even on my role in nature was no longer the same. In the past, I always saw myself as a protector of nature, a bystander observing, preserving, and intervening only when necessary. But today, I realize that I'm not just an overseer. I am part of nature, part of the intricate yet beautiful relationship that binds all living beings on this planet. I thought about the mother bear's eyes, a gaze I could never forget. In them, I saw intelligence, a plea, and above all, a fierce love for her cubs. I realized that despite our differences as species, there are things that transcend those boundaries: love, sacrifice, and the desire to protect what matters most. That morning, the bear family had moved on, but what they left behind in me will never fade. I don't know if they found a safer place, but I believe they'll remember that a human once opened their heart to help them in their most vulnerable moment. And I, too, will forever remember the moment nature touched my soul in the deepest way. I looked out the window, where the snow continued to fall thickly, blanketing the forest in white. A thought suddenly crossed my mind. Perhaps we humans need to learn how to listen to nature more. The sound of the wind, the rustling of leaves, or even a glance from a wild animal. These could all be messages if we are willing to open our hearts and listen. That morning wasn't just a story about the survival of a bear family. It was a story about connection, about trust between things that seem irreconcilable. I smiled, feeling grateful to have witnessed and become part of that miracle. And I know that every time I see bear tracks in the snow, I will always remember that nature is not just something we protect, it is something that protects us in its own unique way.